The chill in the cabin was sharp, not just the Oregon coastal air, but the icy dread clotting in Elijah Thorne's chest. His hands, raw and scarred from years tending the isolated Tillamook light, shook violently as he held the syringe. Outside, the restless Pacific gnawed at the cliffs, a dull, ceaseless roar that usually comforted him, but now sounded like a countdown. 5:52 a.m. Sunrise. Lyra, his 16-year-old daughter, lay pale and impossibly still on the cot, watching him with an unnerving lucidity that belied the terror gripping her small frame. "The vial, Papa. Now," she ordered, her voice thin as chipped glass. "If you hesitate, if you try to call Dr. Albright again, I will do it myself, and it will be messy." This was the impossible choice demanded by the cruel, secret pact they had forged. Either Elijah administers the untested serum, a concoction Lyra secretly synthesized, claiming it was the final, desperate antidote to the neurological blight that had begun stealing her memory and motor control 6 months ago, or she would use the lethal dose of morphine hidden beneath her pillow, ensuring the sunrise found only silence. Elijah's whole life had been defined by a crippling, guilt-driven, paternal overprotectiveness, a fatal flaw. Born from the tragedy of losing his wife during Lyra's birth, he saw his daughter not as a resilient young woman, but as a fragile artifact he was doomed to break. That flaw now forced his hand. He feared his refusal would be the very thing that destroyed her. He could smell the metallic tang of the antiseptic alcohol mixing with the salt-laced humidity that permeated the small space. The texture of the rough cotton sheet beneath his palm felt like sandpaper, a physical anchor against the dizzying moral freefall. He had exactly 2 hours and 16 minutes, until 5:52 a.m., to obey her or risk losing her forever to an absolute certainty. He had always believed that controlling the boundaries would protect the center. Now he realized he had only built a beautiful cage. The chill in the cabin was sharp, not just the Oregon coastal air, but the icy dread clotting in Elijah Thorne's chest. He tasted the bitter ash of the coffee he'd gulped down an hour ago, focusing instead on the low, vibrating hum of the diesel generator, the lifeline of their isolated existence on the Oregon coast, trying to drown out the unsettling silence emanating from his daughter. He'd brought her here, to this relic of stone and sea, 6 months ago, convinced the clean air and his proximity would somehow hold the sickness at bay. He knew, with a certainty that curdled his stomach, that the real isolation was not physical. It was the wall he had built between them. The illness, which started with Lyra forgetting simple physics equations and progressed to seizing tremors, had terrified him into action. When she spoke excitedly of using her knowledge to synthesize experimental compounds, a desperate search fueled by her advanced biochemistry studies, Elijah hadn't listened. His paternal overprotectiveness kicked in immediately. He cut off her communication with the state's medical researchers she admired and confiscated her sophisticated chemistry gear, reasoning that risk must be minimized at all costs. He thought he was saving her from herself, safeguarding the only thing he had left. He thought forcing her confinement in this lighthouse on the edge of the United States was protection. Now, looking at the crude, unmarked vial she had somehow created in secret, likely utilizing the restricted chemicals from his old lighthouse maintenance kit, Elijah saw the devastating result of his control. She had been forced underground, operating entirely without supervision, because he had refused to accept her agency, refused to see her as a competent scientist, only as his vulnerable child. "Lyra, this doesn't stop the clock. We still have maybe 1 hour and 50 minutes left to contact Albright. They have clinical trials," Elijah pleaded, his voice a ragged whisper, the syringe now resting on the bedside table. "This serum, we don't know what's in it." Lyra offered a chilling, resigned smile. "The clock stops at 5:52, Papa. Albright is 3,000 miles away, and he wouldn't approve this. Not until I was dead. I had to choose certainty over slow decay. You taught me that, when you chose this isolation over proper hospitals." Her indictment sliced deeper than any physical pain. The salt spray misted the small window. The window pane felt cold and slick beneath Elijah's desperate touch. Every sound, the distant clang of a buoy bell, the groan of the old foundation, sounded like judgment. If he had only trusted her intellect rather than fearing her fragility, perhaps this terrible chemical weapon wouldn't be resting inches from her vein. He had to move quickly. Time was draining away. leaving less than 2 hours to choose between two forms of destruction. He grabbed the vial. It was cool glass against his warm, calloused palm. The liquid inside a clear, shimmering amber, beautiful and utterly terrifying. Elijah watched the small, involuntary spasm ripple through Lyra's left arm, a reminder that the neurological decay was accelerating. Less than 90 minutes now until the deadline, 5:52 a.m. His paternal overprotectiveness demanded he refuse, that he smash the vial and restrain her until help, the help he trusted, arrived. But the look in her eyes, the desperate plea mixed with the threat of self-destruction, paralyzed him. She wasn't asking him to save her. She was asking him to respect her choice, even if it was suicide. Elijah knelt beside the cot. The room smelled faintly of ozone and stale institutional disinfectant, the scent clinging to her medical equipment. He inhaled deeply, trying to gather his resolve. His knuckles were white where they gripped the metal frame of the bed, the cold, smooth texture a stark contrast to the burning ache in his chest. "I need you to tell me what this is, Lyra." "Exactly," he demanded, his voice dropping low, demanding honesty. Lyra's lips cracked slightly as she spoke, conserving energy. "It's a viral vector, modified from the T7 strain they were testing at the United States biolabs, but with a specific enzyme inhibitor designed to bypass the blood-brain barrier. It either stops the degradation, or it accelerates everything." The clarity of her understanding was astounding, a cruel testament to the genius he had spent 6 months trying to suppress. Elijah's jaw tightened. She had accessed restricted information, perhaps even stolen materials. His failure wasn't just in stopping her from accessing traditional medicine, it was in underestimating her desperate capability. He should have known she wouldn't surrender passively to the sickness. He watched her hand twitch, the fine motor control diminishing with every passing second. He drew the serum into the syringe. The viscous resistance of the liquid as it filled the barrel made a soft, sickening schlick sound. The distant, continuous thrum of the ocean was the only constant noise. Everything else was amplified. He looked at the frail, brilliant girl before him, the sunrise drawing closer. He had to trust her research, the way he should have trusted her character all along. He cleaned the injection site on her inner arm. The skin was impossibly soft beneath the scratchy cotton of her worn pajamas. He held the needle steady. 1 hour and 15 minutes. If he failed, if this was a mistake, he would live with the knowledge that his fear had been the midwife to her death. Elijah pressed the plunger. The cold liquid entered Lyra's vein, a moment of irreversible commitment that stole the air from his lungs. He heard only the high-pitched metallic whine of the generator momentarily surging outside. He removed the needle, pressing a small piece of gauze to the tiny puncture mark. The gauze felt rough and dry against the sudden cold sweat breaking out on his own forehead. They waited. The digital clock on the old radio unit glared 5:03 a.m. 49 minutes remaining. Lyra's body remained entirely rigid, her eyes wide and fixed on the ceiling. Elijah watched her pupils, searching for any sign of change, any immediate reaction. He searched the room, his gaze snagging on the small, hidden workbench beneath a pile of old navigational charts, where she must have performed the synthesis, his sight of it now an overwhelming proof of his negligence. He had protected the light, but he had blinded himself to the dark corners of her struggle. Then came the first tremor. It wasn't the slow, creeping seizure he had grown accustomed to. This was violent, a sudden, full-body spasm that jolted her off the cot. A low, guttural moan tore from her throat, a sound Elijah had never heard, a sound that shredded his control. "Lyra, what's happening?" He reached for her, but she flinched away, fighting him with surprising, desperate strength. "Integration," she choked out, her voice now unrecognizable, laced with pain. "Fever is necessary. Too fast." The skin around the injection site was blanching, turning a sickly, opaque white, spreading rapidly up her arm toward her shoulder. The cabin temperature, already low, seemed to drop further, sucking the heat from the room. He could smell the sharp, coppery scent of accelerated metabolism, a smell similar to an electrical fire. This was the first hurdle, the immediate physiological response. If the serum was correctly balanced, the fever would break, the integration would stabilize. If it wasn't, the accelerated reaction would destroy her body's natural defenses within minutes. He knew, with sudden, absolute clarity, that if he had taken her to a specialized clinic in the United States interior months ago, This desperate roll of the dice wouldn't have been necessary. He had chosen isolation, and now isolation was threatening to consume her. He wrapped her tightly in a heavy wool blanket. The scratchy texture of the yarn offered little comfort. He began checking her pulse, his own heart hammering against his ribs, beating faster than the second hand of the clock now showing 5:11 a.m. 37 minutes. The tremor subsided, replaced by a terrifying stillness. Lyra's breathing became shallow, almost imperceptible. Elijah leaned in, listening for the faint, rattling intake of air. The sharp scent of ozone receded, leaving only the pervasive, damp smell of the coast. The clock ticked 5:19 a.m., 33 minutes remaining. Elijah's failure had not merely been overprotectiveness, it was the failure of true partnership. He had treated her intelligence as a dangerous weapon rather than a tool for survival. If he had acted less like a warden and more like a colleague, maybe they could have refined this dangerous cocktail together, under safe conditions. He rose, moving with a sudden panicked energy toward the small radio cabinet. He ripped open the panel, exposing the wires. His hands, usually steady when splicing electrical connections on the old lighthouse mechanism, fumbled now. He had deliberately cut the main antenna line months ago, severing their contact with the rest of the United States, believing that eliminating external communication would eliminate external risk. He needed to splice it now, but the wire ends were oxidized, brittle. "Papa, no!" Lyra managed, the sound barely audible. She strained, trying to reach his arm. Elijah ignored her. He needed to call Albright, to have a medical team standing by if the serum failed at the stroke of 5:52 a.m. He grabbed a pair of wire strippers. The sound of the metal teeth biting into the old copper insulation was a harsh, scraping noise in the quiet room. The exposed wire ends were slick with moisture, a frustrating texture that hindered his grip. Obstacle 1. The challenge of competence. He was a master of mechanical systems, but panic was making him incompetent. He tried to twist the fine strands together, but they slipped. He could feel the minutes dissolving. 5:24 a.m. 28 minutes. "You break the pact, Papa. You contact them and they put me back on the standard timeline. I die slower," Lyra whispered, tears tracking paths through the sweat and fever on her cheeks. "If it's going to fail, let it fail fast. Don't drag this out." Elijah hesitated, the wires dangling uselessly from his trembling fingers. He knew her fear of the slow decay was genuine. She had watched her mind unravel, her capacity shrinking. If he called now, he might be saving her life, but condemning her to the very fate she dreaded. His paternal overprotectiveness demanded he save her physical form. Her dignity demanded he honor her wish for a clean exit. He dropped the wire strippers. They clattered loudly on the wooden floor. He returned to her side, watching the clock move relentlessly toward the light. Elijah sat back down, planting his feet firmly on the damp wooden floorboards. The floor felt cold, the rough grain digging into his heels. He listened to the steady, hypnotic clink, clink, clink of the lighthouse mechanism rotating above them, a rhythm of duty that felt utterly meaningless now. Lyra's breathing stabilized marginally, but the fever had intensified. Her skin was hot and dry to the touch, radiating intense heat. The cabin now smelled sharply of ozone again, not from the generator, but from her accelerated internal chemistry. The irony was cruel. The light that guided ships through the darkness was incapable of guiding him through this personal nightmare. He began to talk, filling the pressurized silence, telling her stories of his youth in the interior United States, places far from the crushing immensity of the Pacific. He spoke of his wife, a subject they rarely touched, trying to offer Lyra an emotional anchor to hold on to while her physical form threatened to dissolve. "Your mother, she hated the isolation here, but she respected the duty," he murmured, stroking her forehead with a thumb. The heat radiating off her felt alarming, like touching sun-baked metal. "She used to tell me that the greatest scientists are the ones who dare to risk everything. She'd be proud of you, Lyra. Terrified, but proud." This acknowledgement, a grudging admission that her scientific endeavor was valid, was the first step away from his restrictive mindset. His paternal overprotectiveness had always insisted that risk was synonymous with failure. Now, facing the irreversible consequence of her own calculated risk, he had to admit his version of safety was just a slow death sentence. 5:35 a.m., 17 minutes. As he spoke, Lyra reached out, her fingers weakly grasping his shirt. "My notes," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "They are in the copper box, beneath the floorboard near the hearth. If this fails, they must get to Albright. They need to know the enzyme mapping was correct. It's the only way to save the others." He pressed her hand. "I promise." He knew then that she had sacrificed her own chance at a controlled death to ensure the viability of the cure for strangers across the states. The realization of her profound selflessness was the pivot point. Lyra was no longer just his fragile daughter. She was a martyr of science. He was just the guardian of her final, desperate work. The rough, damp fabric of his shirt crumpled beneath her weakening grip. He could hear the ocean outside, the waves now crashing higher, a furious, white noise crescendo. 5:40 a.m., 12 minutes. A shadow passed over the small window, the slow rotation of the light beam itself. Lyra's face was chalk white, her lips tinged blue. Her pulse, when Elijah checked it against the rough texture of her wrist, was racing, thin and erratic. He knew they were entering obstacle 2, the dilemma moral. If the serum failed now, he had 2 choices. Administer the lethal morphine Lyra had prepared, ensuring she died peacefully and on her own terms, thus honoring his promise. Or attempt the splice again, call Albright, and subject her to invasive, painful life support measures that might prolong her existence but shatter her dignity. The vial of morphine was hidden beneath the pillow. He could feel the small, cold glass tube through the thin cotton. This was the moment his paternal overprotectiveness fought a deadly war against his promise to her autonomy. His instinct screamed, "Keep her alive at all costs." But her eyes, though clouded with fever, held a silent, unwavering command. End it cleanly if the science fails. He reached under the pillow. His fingers closed around the smooth, fragile glass. How could he choose between being a father and being a servant to her wishes? It was a cruelty only life and the United States medical bureaucracy could inflict. Suddenly, Lyra gasped, a sharp, ragged inhalation that pulled her entire torso taut. Her eyes snapped toward Elijah, not with pain, but with a terrifying clarity. "The solvent," she whispered, the words rushing out with frantic urgency. "The extraction solvent. It wasn't filtered properly. Trace metals." The whole scenario flipped. Reversion. 1. The assumption that the serum was simply a binary outcome, cure or poison, was wrong. The serum itself wasn't the sole threat. Contamination was. The trace metals, she explained rapidly, would not kill her directly, but they would immediately bind the active viral vector, rendering the entire antidote inert before it could integrate. The violent fever wasn't integration. It was her body reacting to the metallic impurity. Elijah's mind raced. If the vector was inert, she was still dying of the original neurological blight. The serum hadn't fixed anything, but it hadn't killed her yet either. "What do I do, Lyra? Tell me," he shouted, his voice cracking against the ceiling. "Stabilizer. The green vial in the kit. The neurostabilizer I made for the early tremors. It should counteract the metal binding. Give the vector a chance to restart integration," she managed, her breath failing. He dropped the morphine vial. It rolled silently under the cot. His promise of a peaceful death vanished, replaced by a brutal second chance. 5:44 a.m., 8 minutes remaining. Elijah scrambled across the cold floor, tearing open the crude cabinet where Lyra had stored her makeshift laboratory equipment. His movements were jerky, desperate. He found the small, green-capped vial nestled among old cleaning fluids, a relic of the sickness's earlier stage, intended only to quell minor spasms. The glass was cold and smooth in his hand. He didn't hesitate this time. He plunged a fresh syringe into the stabilizer, drawing the thick, dark green liquid. The thick smell of camphor and alcohol rose from the vial. 5:46 a.m., 6 minutes. Lyra was seizing again, her entire body arching backward off the cot. The sound of her teeth clamping down was sickeningly audible. He pinned her down gently, holding her rigid, shaking form against the coarse wool blanket. "I need a vein, Lyra. I can't hold you." She fought the seizure just long enough to jerk her arm free, pointing to a vein in her neck, prominent against the pale skin. Elijah saw the raw, terrifying determination in her eyes, urging him to pierce the fragile skin. This demanded absolute precision, a steadiness he was rapidly losing. His own hands, still trembling from the morphine dilemma, felt clumsy and huge. It was the most terrifying operating table in the whole of the United States, operated by a man whose skill was in gears and glass, not human tissue. He pressed the needle against her neck. The skin offered surprising resistance, the texture taut and thin. He pushed the stabilizer into her bloodstream. The plunger moved quickly. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Lyra went instantly limp, her body collapsing back onto the cot like a sack of stones. Her eyes fluttered, then rolled back, revealing only the whites. The heat radiating from her body intensified, now feeling like a physical flame. He pulled the needle out. A single drop of dark blood welled and tracked a path across her neck. He wiped it away, the blood feeling thick and sticky on his thumb. 5:48 a.m. 4 minutes. Elijah lifted her limp body, holding her close to his chest. Her fragility was palpable, yet he recognized the terrible beauty of her fierce fight. He pressed his face against her hair, inhaling the faint, sweet scent of sea salt and fever. He realized the severity of his paternal overprotectiveness had peaked with the refusal to trust her scientific judgment. He had tried to substitute his physical protection for her intellectual competence. Now, with 4 minutes to sunrise, he was utterly helpless, reduced to holding her as her brilliant, failing mind fought the final battle. All he could do was wait for the clock to strike 5:52 a.m., to see if her last-minute fix was enough to overcome his initial mistake. The cabin was silent again, save for the escalating thunder of the ocean outside. The clock showed 5:50 a.m., 2 minutes. Elijah held Lyra, feeling the erratic, shallow rise and fall of her chest against his own. He looked down at the pale, still face, recognizing the devastating beauty of a life spent in pursuit of knowledge, a pursuit he had relentlessly hindered. He could smell the acrid, metallic odor of her internal furnace slowing down. He had always feared the ocean's power, but now he understood that the true consuming force was his own controlling fear. He closed his eyes, focusing on the rough, damp wool of the blanket pressing against his skin. This was the moment of reckoning. Obstacle 3, the crisis. If she died now, it would not be the original illness, nor the serum, but the consequence of the metallic contamination, which she had been forced to face alone because he had cut her off from medical resources and collaborative safety protocols back in the United States. His paternal overprotectiveness had resulted in her total loss, regardless of the outcome. The first faint gray light of dawn began to seep under the door. The horizon was turning a bruised purple. Suddenly, Lyra's fingers twitched against his shirt, and a faint, almost imperceptible warmth spread through her skin, replacing the terrifying heat. The color, the slightest tinge of pink, returned to her lips. Elijah stared, scrutinizing her face. A small, dry cough escaped her throat. She shifted, her head resting more comfortably against his shoulder. "Papa." Her voice was weak, but steady. It was Lyra's voice, not the strained, sick whisper from minutes before. He pulled back just enough to see her eyes open. They were clear, lucid. She focused on the digital clock. 5:51 a.m., 1 minute. It worked, she breathed, a tiny, triumphant smile fighting its way onto her face. The stabilizer counteracted the binding. The T7 vector. It's integrating. I can feel the change. A single minute to go. The dawn was breaking, and the impossible seemed to have happened. Elijah gripped her tighter, burying his face in her hair. Relief flooded him, so intense it was dizzying. He had gambled on her brilliance, and he had won. The sunrise was coming, and Lyra was alive. He had served her, following her impossible orders, and against all odds, the desperate choice had yielded a miracle. The relentless ocean noise seemed to quiet slightly, transforming from a roar of judgment to a whisper of awe. The clock turned 5:52 a.m. Sunrise. The ordeal was over. Lyra slept peacefully through the morning, the deep, restorative sleep of a body finally free of chemical conflict. Elijah sat beside her, not moving for hours, listening to the regular, healthy rhythm of her breathing. He studied her face, memorizing the subtle return of color, the relaxation around her eyes. He had saved her physical life by finally conceding to her brilliant mind, but the guilt of his initial obstruction settled over him like a suffocating shroud. He had earned the right to see her live, but not the right to forget the risk he had imposed upon her. Around noon, Lyra woke. She was alert, hungry, and remarkably clear-headed. Her first movement was to test her motor skills. She rotated her wrist, flexing her fingers, movements that had been impossible only 12 hours earlier. A genuine smile, the first he had seen in months, bloomed across her face. "I need the copper box, Papa. The notes," she ordered, her voice firm and full of purpose. "We need to analyze the reaction sequence now, before the data fades. I need to contact Albright immediately. The United States research community needs this map." Elijah retrieved the box from beneath the hearth. The copper was cold and heavy in his hands, bearing the faint, dusty smell of the floorboards. Inside, carefully organized, were thick stacks of complex equations and diagrams, all in Lyra's precise, minute handwriting. This was her legacy, her gift to the world, a scientific breakthrough forged in desperation. He handed her the box. As she began rapidly scanning the pages, reviewing the complex molecular pathways she had mapped out, her expression shifted. The triumphant relief faded, replaced by a deep furrow of concentration. "The binding was critical," she murmured, tracing a line of chemical symbols with her finger. The metal impurities were trace elements of cadmium and arsenic, from the distilled water I used for the final filtration. I should have accounted for that. She looked up at Elijah, a strange, distant expression in her eyes. "Papa, did I tell you about the stabilizer before the final crash? The green vial?" Elijah's throat tightened. He remembered the desperate rush of words, the clarity that preceded the seizure. "Yes, you told me the stabilizer would counteract the metal binding. It saved you." Lyra's brow furrowed, her fingers rubbing the rough, weathered pages. "No, that's not right. I hypothesized the stabilizer would accelerate the toxicity of the cadmium if the viral vector was inert. I discarded that protocol 2 weeks ago. I planned to use a standard chelation agent, but I ran out." The memory of the terrifying urgency, the near-fatal gamble, suddenly felt sharp and wrong. Elijah froze. If she hadn't given him the instruction, then who had? And why had the stabilizer, which she believed to be toxic in that situation, actually worked? He watched her eyes, searching for the brilliant scientist who had just survived the impossible. 5:00 p.m. The day was drawing to a close. Lyra stared intently at the notes, tracing the molecular diagrams, her breathing quiet and even. The return of her physical strength was undeniable, but a deep fissure of confusion began to spread across her face. Elijah felt the smooth, cold copper of the box against his leg. "I remember the initial fever, Papa, the agonizing pain of the metal binding," Lyra continued, her voice gaining speed, fueled by confusion. "And I remember thinking, I must tell him about the chelation agent. But then, nothing. I remember the pain. And then I remember waking up this morning, feeling new." Elijah's blood ran cold. He had vividly remembered her gasping, shouting the instructions for the stabilizer. Had the trauma warped his perception? He needed proof, a physical sign. He rushed to the overturned radio cabinet, where the wire strippers still lay on the floor. He picked them up, the metal cold and rigid. If he had truly hallucinated the command, then the stabilizer injection had been a reckless, blind guess, driven by sheer, desperate panic. He stared at the exposed wires where he had tried, and failed, to reconnect the antenna earlier that morning. They were still separated, the copper oxidized. He hadn't spliced them. He hadn't called Albright. But then, he looked closely at the radio unit. Tucked beneath the battery housing, where he hadn't thought to look, was a small, crudely etched note. He pulled it out. It was a fragment of thin paper, smelling faintly of the same antiseptic alcohol he used on the syringe. In small, shaky handwriting that was unmistakably Lyra's, it read, "Papa, stabilizer is the key. Use it, 5:48 a.m. "Lyra," Elijah whispered, his voice trembling. He held out the note. "When did you write this?" Lyra took the paper. She studied the script, turning it over in her hands. Her clear eyes narrowed. "I didn't. This isn't my active handwriting. This looks like my penmanship from 3 weeks ago, before the fine motor control began to fail." The mystery deepened. Who had left the life-saving note? And why did the handwriting suggest a time when she was already sick, yet months before the final crisis? Lyra pressed her fingers gently to her temple, leaning back against the cot. "Papa, the sickness isn't just physical. It's a neurological plague that degrades memory, structure, and motor skills. But during the initial stages, there were moments of hyper-lucidity, focused intellectual bursts." She looked at the note again, her breath hitching. I wrote this, Papa. But not this morning. I wrote this 3 weeks ago, during one of those lucid spells. I calculated the precise time of the eventual contamination failure, the cadmium reaction, and dictated the emergency protocol for you, knowing I wouldn't be able to articulate it in the moment of crisis. This was reversion 2, the final revelation. Lyra hadn't ordered the stabilizer in a frantic gasp of pain. Her deteriorating mind, the one he had tried to suppress and silence, had planned her own rescue weeks in advance, predicting his failure to call for help and the exact parameters of the chemical crisis. She hadn't trusted her immediate self, but she had trusted her past, brilliant self. The true hero wasn't the scientist who survived, but the scientist who prepared for her own collapse. The implications of the small, brittle note were enormous. Elijah's desperate decision to inject the stabilizer hadn't been an act of random panic, but the fulfillment of a precise, predetermined scientific instruction given by a past version of his daughter, a version that understood the chaos of the immediate future. Elijah's pawn's paternal overprotectiveness had driven him to try to protect her from external dangers, yet the real safety net had been her own internal foresight. He slumped onto the cot, the rough cotton beneath him feeling suddenly suffocating. "You calculated everything," he stated, the words dull and heavy. The metal impurities, the accelerated toxicity, the window for intervention. You set up the failsafe weeks ago, knowing I would panic and reject outside help. Lyra reached out, her hand resting on his arm, a gesture of comfort that felt painfully reversed. Her skin was warm, resilient. "I had to ensure the data survived, Papa. And if the data survived, I needed the vector to survive. It was the only way to save the others. I knew, based on your previous actions, that you would attempt to solve the problem internally, within the lighthouse, just before the deadline. I planned for your flaw." His failure wasn't just in controlling her. It was in underestimating the strategic depth of her love for humanity over her love for herself. They spent the rest of the evening in the warm, diffused glow of the setting sun, Lyra diligently organizing her research notes. The copper box smelled of oxidized metal and triumph. Elijah finally managed to splice the radio wires, his hands now steady, driven by a new duty, connecting Lyra's breakthrough to the medical establishment of the United States. As darkness fell, Elijah transmitted the data packet, a thick volume of molecular diagrams and viral vector analysis. He spoke briefly with Dr. Albright, who, initially skeptical of the remote distress call from the Oregon coast, quickly shifted to stunned reverence as he reviewed the complexity of the equations. "She did it, Thorne." Albright's voice crackled over the radio, thick with professional awe. "She mapped the enzymatic blocker. This is the cure, provided the stabilization holds. Get her to a facility, now." The victory was intoxicating, but the final, required, cost of victory was yet to be revealed. Days later, Lyra was transported via Coast Guard helicopter from the rugged Oregon coastline to a specialized research facility in the metropolitan United States interior. Elijah flew with her, watching the towering cliffs and the Tillamook light shrink into the vast Pacific. The victory felt tangible. Lyra was undeniably cured. Her motor skills were restored, her intellectual acuity sharper than ever. However, the cost of victory began to manifest during her initial evaluations. Albright explained the findings, his voice hushed and grave, outside Lyra's sterile temporary lab. "The viral vector was successful, Elijah. It arrested the degradation, but Lyra's earlier, pre-stabilizer contamination, the cadmium and arsenic, caused localized, permanent neuronal death in the hippocampus, specifically the area governing episodic memory formation." Elijah gripped the cold, stainless steel railing of the observation deck. The smell of sterile air was sharp and unforgiving. "In layman's terms?" Elijah demanded, his throat tight. "She is completely cured of the blight. She can think, learn, and perform complex calculations. Her genius is intact, but she won't form new long-term memories. She will live perpetually in the present moment, always recalling everything up until the point of stabilization, but nothing new will stick after that." Elijah walked into Lyra's room. She was bent over a high-powered microscope, engrossed in an analysis of her own cellular structure. She looked up, her face bright with genuine enthusiasm. "Papa, look at this tissue sample. The integration is stable. We need to isolate the non-receptive proteins immediately." You did it, Lyra. You saved yourself and you saved the work, Elijah said, forcing a smile that felt like shattered glass. Lyra smiled back, warm and immediate. I know, Papa. I just need to compile these notes for Dr. Albright before the deadline. Do you remember the copper box? I put them under the hearth. Elijah's heart wrenched. He had handed her the copper box 3 days ago, and she had spent 48 hours compiling those very notes. He swallowed the lump in his throat. His victory, her survival, was absolute. But he had lost his future with her. Every new shared memory, every conversation about their journey, their redemption, would vanish with the turning of the day. Yes, Lyra, Elijah replied, walking to her side, leaning his head close so she could smell the familiar scent of salt and diesel from the coast still clinging to his jacket. I remember the copper box. It's a wonderful idea. He ran his calloused thumb across the smooth, clean skin of her forehead, tracing the invisible line where the fever had broken just before sunrise. The pawn and paternal overprotectiveness Gba was finally gone, replaced by a quiet, enduring devotion. He had learned to trust her, but the price of that lesson was the permanent loss of their shared future. He would live his remaining days as the lighthouse keeper, eternally guiding the girl who would wake up every morning in the belief that the battle had just begun. He had served his daughter before sunrise like she ordered, achieving the miracle she sought, but regretting that morning not for the risk taken, but for the memory permanently erased.